Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Thursday night Anamkara meditation program. With all my heart and with all my love, I welcome you to our program tonight. And thank you for coming. And thank you for bringing the power of your practices, the power of your commitment to true knowing, and bringing that into the world in the many ways that you do. So it's great to be able to gather together on Thursday evenings with everybody. And, it's to help shift our vision. Though our unity has never been broken, the mind is easily fooled by differences. So we have to help in order to cultivate it coming back to the truth of who and what we are. So again, thank you all for coming this evening. And we're going to be starting in a few minutes with the opening mantras. The opening mantras are a way of invoking what our highest nature is. And so we start with that in order to help clear the mind of all the things it's been identified with, caught up in throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout lifetimes actually. So we keep coming back to the power of the mantra and mantras in general as a throb of the infinite, a throb of our own highest nature that takes the form of sound and words in order to transform the mind, clear it, so it can perceive, once again, what's already fully present, fully unfolded, your divine nature. So we start with the opening mantras and then just sit for a moment in the stillness. The stillness is seen as the fruit of mantra practice. Mantras arise out of stillness and dissolve into stillness. So when the mind can enter the vehicle of mantra, it can go into that stillness, into that pure spaciousness of being, that wide open sky of awareness. And that's where we come to know directly the truth of that divine presence that's always here. So we'll start with the opening mantras. Shri Mata Kali Devi Ki Jai Gajananam Ganari Sevitam Kapita Jambo Palacharu Vakshanam Umasutam Shokam Vinashakarakam Namami Vigneshwara Parapankajam Shree Ganeshaya Namaha Shree Ganeshaya Namaha Shree Ganeshaya Namaha Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamudaya Purnameva Vashishate Om Shanti 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 Shri Mata Kali Devi Ki Jai. So once again, with all my heart, I welcome you this evening to our program. Again, thank you so much for coming. Tonight is the first Thursday of the month, so in our cycle of programs is where we focus more on what's classically known as a dharma talk, a dharma meaning practice, and the kinds of sadhana practices, the spiritual practices that we do, and the ways that we cultivate our understanding and deepening our understanding of what the practices empower us to know, and the things that unfold in the course of our practices and our spiritual development. So tonight I wanted to focus on something that we often don't talk about, because we're often talking about what's hidden is that ecstatic, rapturous, divine nature of whom and what we are. But we should talk some about what gets in the way of that. And of course it's the mind, but there are aspects of the mind, and especially what's known as shadow. And shadow is a term especially came out of the work of Carl Jung. I studied as a Jungian many years ago in my professional development as a psychotherapist. But the shadow side has been recognized, for millennia, that this is the dark side of who we are in terms of our ordinary sense of self and what the nature of the mind is. And it's been recognized, of course, in spiritual traditions as important to look at. In fact, in the Kundalini tradition, which is one of the most esoteric aspects of the yogic tradition, and Kundalini really refers to the boundless power of consciousness that creates this mind and body, becomes all that it is. And also it's the power, the light of consciousness that then finally winds up illuminating the truth of who and what we are and sets our consciousness free from being caught and just identified with the mind and a little sense of self. And there's a wonderful text, an ancient hymn to the Kundalini called the Kundalini Stavaha. And when I was studying with Swami Muktananda for many years, we used to chant the Kundalini Stavaha. And in it, there's a shloka that says, "One who wants the highest attainment and knows his own shortcomings becomes victorious while living on earth through the knowledge of Shree Kundalini." So it's not just about knowing, what our highest nature is in order to have this highest attainment. It also means that we've illuminated those shortcomings, the shadow side, the places where we get stuck, the places where we get caught, that's also a part of becoming free. So we don't become free by shunning it. We don't become free by repressing it. We become free by having illuminated, transformed it, set the energy that was bound in that free. So as practices like meditation and contemplation, study, they not only help refine our understanding of how the mind works and how practices work and what some of these other domains of transcendence and transpersonal consciousness are, they also help to illuminate the ways that the mind is bound, the ways that the mind gets caught. And in that we see that there was a tremendously developed psychology in the Eastern traditions going back literally thousands of years. They were talking about the conditioned mind long, millennia before the behavioral tradition developed in the West. They were talking about insights into, how the ego operates and what the dynamics of that are. And so when we study the depths of these traditions, we see there's a very sophisticated psychology that was involved. And so that there are means for being able to help both contain, illuminate, and transform these shadow dimensions of who and what we are. And we see these encoded in practices. We're familiar, of course, with, the Ten Commandments. It's a way of helping the shadow side of humanity get contained, follow these, and you won't so easily fall into these other kinds of patterns that can be destructive to ourselves and others. Christ's teaching of, love thy neighbor as thyself is a teaching about going beyond the shadow and being able to enter that state of the magnanimous quality of love that's a reflection of the truth of who we are. So Christ's path of agape, of this unconditional love, is informed by that. Buddhist tradition, we have the Noble Eightfold Path. And in that, there are components that have to do with ethics and ethical practices, following the dharma, of right living, right action, things like that. In the yogic tradition, and especially as it was codified by Patanjali back around the time of Buddha, so these teachings were familiar to Buddha as well. And Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras talks about Ashtanga Yoga, meaning the classic form of Ashtanga Yoga. It means the 8 limbs of yoga. And it starts out with what are called the yamas and the niyamas. And of course the yamas and niyamas in the yoga tradition are known as the restraints and observances, the do's and don'ts. And when you study those, and they're the foundation of yoga, though most people unfortunately think of yoga as postures or breathing techniques, or asana, pranayama, meditative techniques. But that whole edifice of yoga rests on the yamas and the niyamas. And without those, we can't construct all the rest. And so the yamas and the niyamas, again, parallels in all of the great spiritual traditions, are just a clear way of understanding that. And there's some variations in the lists. The classic list is 10, but there are lists of 12 and more. But the classic 10, the 5 yamas, the 5 niyamas. In the yamas, the restraints, the foundation of yogic and Buddhist thought is the yama of ahimsa, non-violence. Non-violence, the practice of non-violence. That is the foundation. That is the absolute commitment that any seeker, anyone following the path of dharma, yoga dharma, Buddha dharma, religious dharma, non-violence. That's the ground of it all, ahimsa. Also, the next one is called Satya. It means being truthful. Being truthful. You're restraining the impulse to lie, to be untruthful. You practice truthfulness. Asteya is the third of the yamas, and it means non-stealing. So, of course, we don't steal. Some of these are very obvious, but there are subtler dimensions of these. So something like stealing, the obvious thing, you don't take something that belongs to another person. But think of the ways that the mind appropriates things to itself that doesn't belong to it. See, in the yoga tradition, the ego mind is known as the power of self-appropriation. It identifies with, it takes things that aren't really its real nature, don't belong to it, including consciousness itself. Consciousness doesn't belong to the ego mind. Ego mind is content in the field of consciousness. A little subtle, but contemplate that. That's the truth of it. But think of all the ways the ego mind goes throughout the day, appropriating things. You're driving down a highway. Suddenly it's your lane. Somebody comes into it's my lane. They came into my lane. You pull into a parking lot. Somebody took my parking space. How did that become your parking space? Power of self-appropriation. The ego mind is appropriating things to itself, taking ownership, saying that's mine. I, me, mine, mine. So we need to be aware of that and see that. It's part of the shadow. It's part of how this operates, this individualized form of awareness that we call the ego mind. The fourth of the yamas is Brahmacarya. And it means really celibacy, continence. It means really not being driven by desire. And that's reeling that energy in, so we're not just compulsively, impulsively driven by that. And so the practice of that restraint is codified as Brahmacharya. It's also a phase in the traditional path that one goes through in the Hindu tradition of Brahmacharya, and studying with one's master and practicing that, so all your energy is going into realizing the highest truth. And then the fifth one is Aparigraha, and it means non-acquisitiveness. And that's so that we're not cultivating. We live in a culture that is all about, you have to acquire things in order to have meaning, in order to have purpose, in order to have status, in order to have this, that, and the other thing. Acquisitiveness. So being non-acquisitive is really significant as a practice for both pulling your energy in, so we're not leaking that out, and not caught in the illusion that joy and happiness are going to arise out of acquiring something. Because the fundamental truth, another fundamental truth out of the meditative traditions is joy spontaneously arises within us. That is one of the irreducible qualities of who we are, called ananda, this bliss, this rapturous ecstasy. And the yogic tradition talked about how the delusion of that being outside comes through conditioning. Because the mind gets agitated by desires. It has these desires that comes out of its acquisitiveness and it's wanting to appropriate things it doesn't have quite yet. Gets agitated, goes after pursuing whatever that desire might be, finally gets a hold of it, and for a moment the mind goes, I own this. This is mine. I possess this. And in that stillness, joy arises. So what the ancient sages realized was the joy didn't come from the object. It came because the agitation of the mind was quieted long enough for it to arise, because that's our nature. That's the nature of our true self. So cut through that, and that's the nature of the spiritual practices. No, go right to the source. Don't project it outside and then get caught in the illusion that you're going to somehow acquire it. Make the mind quiet and still, and you'll see this arising spontaneously. It was part of how Buddha awoke. He'd been doing all these austerities, was starved, could barely lift his hand to get a drink of water to himself. And suddenly joy arose in his mind. And he went, where did that come from? It's uncaused. Where's the source of that? Didn't come from the austerity. Didn't come from anything he had taken. It arose inside. That gave him the insight to then follow what he then later described as the middle way. Not extreme austerity, not indulgence in the world, but this way where you could quiet the mind and come home to that source. So all these different yamas are about deconditioning that and breaking that cycle of projecting joy, fullness, fulfillment outside and saying, no, come inside and know that. Come inside, be free. So that's how the yamas, now that's just the first 5 of the yamas. Then we have the niyamas. So these are more like the observances. So one is called saucha. It's purity. It's purity in diet, purity in thought. And purity also means keeping the company of the truth, in a sense. What do we hold in our mind? What's the company we keep inside and outside? Another of the niyamas is called santosha. Santosha is contentment. Imagine that, a practice of contentment. We have a culture built on trying to create discontent and then trying to sell you things to fix it. The yogis went, no. I mean, this isn't new. We have new objects of desire, but the underlying dynamic has been forever. The yogis went, wait a minute. Practice contentment and know fullness that arises as that's you. Your completeness, your fullness, your wholeness goes beyond anything the mind could ever imagine. Your sublime nature, all-encompassing, all-embracing, nothing left out. The infinitude of your being, know that and you go beyond even contentment. But at least we can practice contentment. Because that's a remedy for then, if you think of these observances, some of them are remedies for some of the things that come up in the yamas. So the acquisitiveness, that's going to be quelled by practicing contentment. It's a practice. We practice contentment. Tapas is another one of the niyamas. And tapas, basically means austerity, but tapas also is a way of talking about how do we restrain the ordinary mind and its outgoing nature, driven by desires, driven by discontent, all of which are seen as having their root in what's called avidya. Because avidya is this primal ignorance. If we knew the truth of who and what we are, the fullness of who and what we are, these other things don't even arise. So austerity is the practice of sort of reeling in the mind, and it creates kind of a friction. The mind keeps wanting to go out and reel it in. You know, we sit down to meditate, and you're sitting there for a couple of minutes, and then the mind goes, no, what's this good as this? I might as well get up and go. But you're restraining it. You've set the timer. You're not going to move until the timer says it's okay. Now there's friction. That friction can cause a little bit of irritation, a little bit of heat. So tapasya is also talked about as fire. The fire of yoga is this tapasya. And it's what partly empowers us to burn through our identification with the mind, its desires, its impulses to do this, that, and the other thing. Because now we're training it to be restrained. So rather than like a wild dog that's been running around without a leash, we're reeling the mind in. We're keeping it on a short leash. And to begin with, it chafes against that. That's tapasya. But it's going to learn, it's going to turn, and then become a wonderful servant for your own infinite nature, your own sublime nature. Because the ego mind's not the enemy. It turns into the vehicle as a humble servant, as a dedicated servant for bringing love, compassion into the world. Right? Another one of the niyamas is called svadhyaya, and it means self-study. And self-study can take many forms: studying texts and scriptures, chanting texts. So like when we were doing the Heart Sutra last week on the 4th Thursdays of the month, that's svadhyaya. That's a way of studying the true nature of who and what we are, as revealed through Buddha's words in the Heart Sutra. Chanting other texts are also referred to as svadhyaya. Studying, contemplation, being able to refine the mind so it can differentiate between the ordinary sense of conventional self and the ego mind and what's the fullness of your true nature. And then the 5th of the niyamas, the observances, is called Ishvara Pranidhana. And it means the devotion and worship of one's personal sense of what the divine might be. And so that can be whatever one's sense of God is. That might, for some it's Shiva, for some it's Vishnu, for some it's the formless presence. But that devotion and connection with a form, because the mind is of the nature of form. The mind is a form. Form is attracted to form. But when we go to a form of the infinite, then we're entering a portal that can take us beyond all forms. But devotion helps to harness this potent energy of love, caring, reverence, devotion, that these two get freed from just being something that the mind is using to be devoted to some other thing or passionate about something else, and takes it and directs it towards what's our highest nature. And it may start out as seemingly separate, as dualistic, but eventually merges so that we have the realization of I am that. Aham Brahmasmi, I am the Absolute. That's where that takes us. So these practices that we know in the yogic tradition as the yamas and the niyamas and other traditions have their ways of speaking about that are all, again, aimed at gathering our energy, pulling it out of our limited self, out of our shadow self, because even in our limited self, we have parts that are unconscious. And that's more classically what we mean by shadow. And so Carl Jung had a few things to say about shadow, actually a lot to say, because he saw the process of transformation that he described as the individuation process starts out confronting shadow. And all those pieces that have been repressed, have been disowned, have been that we're not attending to, they might be driven by shame to ignore them, all kinds of dynamics that go into that. And so Jung saw that as one of the critical pieces that people first engage in when they're even engaging in a therapeutic transformational process, dealing with shadow. So he called that the apprentice piece. The masterpiece he talked about was integrating one's opposite. So the divine feminine for men, the divine masculine for women. That was his understanding of coming to the wholeness of who we are, that we're the fullness of all. But when he's talking about shadow, Jung wrote, confronting the shadow means stop blaming others. Now, that's an interesting understanding. Blaming others. Think of how many times we're quick to blame somebody else when it's really something to do with our own shadow side. It can be an insight into what's in our shadow. And we see people who are in the grips of their shadow constantly blaming others. It's all everybody else's fault, not theirs. Right? Shadow, shadow. They're possessed by the shadow. But Buddha talked about it as well. So 2,500 years ago, Buddha in the Dhammapada wrote, look how he abused me and beat me, how he threw me down and robbed me. Live with such thoughts, and you live in hate. Look how he abused me and beat me, how he threw me down and robbed me. Abandon such thoughts and live in love. Buddha wrote, in this world, hate never yet dispelled hate. Only love dispels hate. This is the law, ancient and inexhaustible. This is the law of dharma. This is the law that Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King tried to adhere to. But it means confronting our own shadow. And it means not joining shadow for shadow and hate for hate, violence for violence. Then we're caught up in the same dynamic. We have to go beyond that. We have to get free. Bring that freedom into that presence. Jung also wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Bringing the light of consciousness into the darkness of our own being. In that darkness is hidden many things, including the magnificence of the fullness of who we are. So the shadow is not just negative things. There's a lot in the shadow. Right? And as we open that up, as we bring the light of consciousness to that, we're also setting it free and setting ourselves free, because things that are bound in that darkness are controlling us from our unconscious. Jung wrote, the enlargement of the light side of consciousness has the necessary consequence that the part of the psyche which is less light and less capable of consciousness is thrown into darkness to such an extent that sooner or later a rift occurs in the psychic system. At first, this is not recognized as such, and therefore is projected. In other words, it appears as a projection, it appears outside. It might be a religious projection in the form of a split between the powers of light and dark, classic in religions, but also inside of ourselves. So our shadow side very quickly and unconsciously projects itself onto others, in part to maintain the illusion, oh, I don't have a shadow, it's out there, it's that other person. And that's, scapegoating is like that, on a collective level, on an individual level. Put it out there, that I don't have to see it, I don't have to own it, I can pretend it's out there, not me. So recognizing such projections, recognizing shadow, that's partly what we need to do for ourselves, but it's also why we need assistance. Because the deep shadow of who we are means we can't see it. It's truly unconscious. So there's a little bit of our dark side that we see and we may try to consciously hide, but we can bring it to mind. But there are parts of our shadow side that are so deep in the unconscious that they can only be brought to light by feedback, by reflections from others. This is part of the sacred nature of the trust between a teacher and a student, between the guru and disciple, was that here was somebody who was so selflessly loving and kind and enlightened that they could shed light on the shadow, knowing it's shadow, it's not who we are. They could do it with love and compassion. They could do it with kindness, so that we don't just immediately bristle with defensiveness and push it away again. But we're dependent on others. And that's also partly why Buddha talked about Sangha as one of the jewels. Sangha meaning the gathering of like-minded seekers, that we help each other become conscious, to see what we may not be seeing ourselves. So that's also a part of what it is to have that kind of assistance in looking at shadow. But also being able to see that we can start to get a hold of shadow if we start to look at certain things that come up automatically. You know, when we're quick to anger about something, when there's irritability, reactivity, impulsivity, an immediate dislike of somebody. You might see somebody, you don't know anything about them. There's an immediate kind of repulsion or something. Those are usually signs that there's something in our own shadow being projected there. Not that the other person may not have some negativity, and we want to be aware of that as well and be skillful about that. But it can also be a sign to be self-reflective, to be self-aware, to consider, oh, what's going on with my shadow in this that's adding that extra energy to this moment. That's what I can take in and transform, right? Change the energy of the situation. The same can be true of infatuation. So infatuation can happen because we're projecting a positive aspect of who we are onto another person. And then we want to own that, we want to possess that and take it back in. And that too is shadow work. Right? So we project positive aspects of who we are, fall in love with it outside, want to possess it, want to be around it, want to embrace it through the other person, when really might be that the truth is we need to find that in ourselves. We need to come home to that quality in ourselves. So these are little signs that we can pay attention to in our practice that can help to illuminate shadow in these ways. We also need to be aware of seeing others who are caught in shadow. And in the spiritual traditions, especially pride and arrogance come up as ways of being able to see people who have disowned their shadow. They're above it, they're beyond it, there's a pride, there's an arrogance. Those are red flags. Of course, other things, hate and anger, blame and shame game. These are all shadow functions. Quickness to defensiveness, quickness to reactivity, impulsivity, one up, one down, maintaining hierarchies. These are often also aspects of shadow. These are not the luminous quality of one's divine nature. They're not the luminous self that embraces all and sees all as equal. So we also want to be aware of that when we see it, and see it as shadow. Seeing it as shadow also helps us to then have compassion, right, for ourselves and others. This is just a limitation. This is a shadow part of that person's being. It's not a reflection of their true nature. We still want to be skillful. Might want to avoid that person, not have certain interactions with them. But we can also have compassion because we've all suffered that. We've all suffered the afflictions that go with our shadows. So we begin to recognize that and have that compassion for others as well. So the shadow side, these are the disowned parts. And they can be positive. They can be our creativity. They can be certain things about our body that were shunned or shamed or things in growing up that we have to re-own and repossess. So many aspects of shadow have been created by ways that we've grown up, both what's happened in our individual families, but also the culture that we've grown up in. Because, culture is cult. That means it's a certain kind of brainwashing. If you get a big enough group and they're all brainwashed together, you say, oh, that's their culture. No, that's still limiting. These are still limiting ideas, limiting belief systems, limiting conditioned aspects of mind that we have to be able to see through and get free of. So those too are shadows. So we can also see that there's shadow sides to groups, there's shadow sides to cultures, there's shadow sides to political parties, the shadow is everywhere, both on an individual level and a collective level. So becoming awake and aware of that allows us to be more skillful in the moment and also be able to stay centered in ourself, in our highest self. So we also want to be able to recognize those signs of someone who's getting free of shadow. And this is often, again, in the literature and writings of sages and saints, one of the qualities that always stands out is humility. The humility that you see in individuals who have done that self-work, who have seen their shadow, know that, they're not just walking around exalted beings. They've walked through the pain, the fire that goes with dealing with the shadow. They've seen it in others. So that kind of humility, that kind of being able to have the compassion to know that every being that we meet is on a path to getting free of their limitations, just as we are. And having that compassion, having that kindness, having that loving awareness, having that equal vision, that we have that equal vision. This is all the divine unfolding. But we want to see it, clearly, and that helps bring that humility and compassion into the moment. That's equal vision. That's that equanimity that is a part of getting free of shadow. So all these things have to do with how do we illuminate both the nature of mind in its good aspects. How does it become a servant? By doing practices, by becoming disciplined, by becoming more and more refined, more and more subtle, and more free of the shadow. And that's awareness that illuminates that. Awareness. Kundalini Shakti is awareness. That's its fundamental quality, is boundless consciousness, boundless awareness, loving awareness, kind awareness, compassionate awareness. We have different words for these, but the Shakti, the energy, the power of that awareness is suffused with these qualities. The mind has different words for love, compassion, joy, equanimity. It's all one in there. When you go into that state, that's all there is. So then, being empowered by that, we can walk that into the world if the mind as a vehicle has gotten free of its bondage and the automaticity of its shadow. That's why we do so much work on the mind and shadow, so that it can truly be a servant of your highest loving, sublime nature. And so Kundalini Shakti, in the path of sadhana, of spiritual practice, it lovingly illuminates these things. It confronts us with it because it knows we need to get free of this. It binds us, creates pain and suffering for ourselves as well as for others. So getting free of that, being able to experience the fullness of awareness, the great mind, the free mind. There was a great Zen master. His name was Soke-an, and he passed away in 1945, so an early 20th century great Zen master. And he wrote, "Your body is not bounded by the surface of your skin, The sun and the moon are your body. The ocean and the rivers are your body. The whole universe is your body. The Buddha based his religion upon this mind, this big mind, this consciousness. Sometimes you call it one body. Sometimes you call it God. We don't use that name for it. But when you observe that your mind is as boundless as the sky, an endless universe, and your present state, this moment, is here. That is all. All the teachings are in your heart. They are inherent, the intrinsic law of your nature. You cannot find this anywhere outside of yourself." So all the words, all the teachings, all the practice, where do they point? They point to source. They point inside. They point, let go of the mind And all the ways we identify with this thought, this feeling, this reaction, this impulse, all those things, come into that stillness. And there, your sublime nature, in all its fullness, in all its loving, joyous, all-embracing nature, there it is. There it is. Nothing left out. It's who you are. So you've always been. A little throb of that consciousness got identified with these little threads of consciousness that we call thoughts, body, mind. It's like the string theory in quantum mechanics, these little strings of energy that make up the atoms, the molecules, the cells, the body. They're all Shakti. They're all Kundalini Shakti. They're all consciousness dancing in this form. To become aware of that, to know that, that's to become free. So in Kali's Bazaar, the poem, let your mind return to its original source, this big mind. Everything else will find its rightful place and assume its rightful size in your life. This boundless mind embraces all. This boundless mind is boundless heart. Know this, and know the love that embraces all. Know this, and know the love that embraces all. Why else are we here? Why else are we here? We're not here to consume everything in sight and still remain empty. What has this cult of culture taught us? Nothing but falsehoods. We have to come home to the truth of who we are, our sublime nature, the fullness of our loving nature. So they're not fighting over crumbs. Who's got more? Who's got a bigger pile of this and more of that? It's not who we are. Come home to yourself. Come home to your sublime nature. You are that boundless one. You are that boundless love. You embrace all. Only the mind embraces the particulars, the divisiveness, the separation. It lives in that domain. You're with it all. You embrace all. Your love can drown the world. Let it free. Let it be completely free. So now we're going to chant, and then we'll meditate in the stillness. And we're going to be chanting the mantras Om Namah Shivaya and Om Kalima. And it's a slow meditative chant. We'll chant for a few minutes and then just sit in the stillness. So Om Namah Shivaya, Shivaya Nama Om. Om Kalima, Kali Durge, Namo Namaha. These are invocations of that masculine and feminine face of the infinite. Come to rest there, and in the stillness, know the absolute fullness of who you are. Your light lights up the world. Your love embraces the world. We do the practices to know that fully so we can walk that into the world.
Shivaya
Kali Durga Namo Namah. Kali Durga Namo Namah. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Shivaya Namah. Shivaya Namah. Om Kalima. Om Kalima. Kali Durga Namo Namah. Kali Durga Namo resting in the stillness, the divine embrace. If the mind moves, invite it to take refuge in Om Namah Shivaya or Om Kalima, the throb of your own sublime nature. Come home to yourself, your boundlessly loving, compassionate self. Kalim Durga Namo Namah. Kalim Durga Namo Namah. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Shivaya Namah. Shivaya Namah. Om Kalima. Om Kalima. Kalim Durga Namo Namah. Kalim Durga Namo Namah. We end with this prayer. That may all our practices truly benefit everyone, and may all beings know complete freedom from suffering. And namaste. So shedding light on the shadow. That's what our practices do. It helps to illuminate it so we can be free of that. So we can come home to just the boundless love, the boundless kindness, the boundless compassion, the boundless joy, the rapturous state of that pure awareness. Just calling to you. Come home to yourself, so that you can walk that into the world. The poor ego mind kind of girds itself and is like ready to walk into the world. But that's it trying to posture as those qualities, not to be a vehicle where it just flows through. There's an ocean ready to just flow through you. So when we drown in that ocean, what else is then going to be there? So keep coming home to the self. Come home to your sublime nature. Come home to the divine. And walk that love, that compassion, that kindness into the world. Especially now, it's needed so badly everywhere. Shadow is everywhere. So be that light. Be that light for just wherever you might be. You carry that light. That incandescent presence. That light in your heart. Always there. Always self-luminous. Come home to that. The mantra is a throb of that. Take refuge in that, and you can bring that into the world. Meditation is a way of bathing in that. Bathe in that. Let go into that. And walk it into the world. So I want to thank you all for coming this evening and bringing your sublime nature to our gathering, bringing the commitment that you have to practice and bring this into the world, for being that light in your everyday life and sharing that with others just by your living presence. Thank you so much. Thank you for your dedication. And thank you, everyone, for the various ways that you help support Anamkara and sharing our YouTube channel and our e-newsletter, making donations. All those are tremendously appreciated. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And we'll be back again next week. And so, once again, with all my heart and with all my love, thank you all for coming. Namaste.